Good morning. What a beautiful, beautiful morning it is. Though it is wet outside, it is dry in here, and we have this opportunity, don't we? To be able to worship today, to be able to sing such wonderful, wonderful songs in which Paul has led us in, and to be able to recognize our God and honor Him and glorify Him today in fellowship. We are going to be looking at today that which we started last week here on Sunday mornings, examining that which comes from Colossians chapter 3 and verse 5 through verse 11, the idea that Paul states forth there, putting off that which is immoral, that which is wrong. And as I mentioned last week, I had not realized until recently how long it had been since I had taught on the moral issues that our society fights, that we as Christians must deal with as we go outside those doors and try to help those whose soul is lost, who has not obeyed the gospel, or even if the time arises, help our own brethren with these issues, as all of us have, no doubt, in one form or a fashion, with one area or another, dealt with different aspects of that. So with that in mind, let's go ahead and read Colossians chapter 3, verse 5 through 11 again. Paul would write, inspired by God, put to death, therefore, what is earthly in you, sexual immorality or fornication, impurity, passion, evil desire, and covetousness, which is idolatry. On account of these, the wrath of God is coming. In these you too once walked when you were living in them. But now you must put them all away: anger, wrath, malice, slander, and obscene talk from your mouth. Do not lie to one another, seeing that you have put off the old self with its practices, and have put on the new self, which is being renewed in knowledge after the image of its Creator. Here there is not Greek and Jew, circumcised and uncircumcised, barbarian, Scythian, slave free, but Christ is all and in all. I was planning this morning on talking about a very hot topic of today's times in abortion, but we're going to push that a couple of weeks as I do some more research, at least on the laws and things of that nature, in light of God's Word. And so this morning, we're going to be looking at another area that has burst forth here in America and has grown quite substantially, and that is the reality of gambling. When we talk about putting to death immorality and putting to death those things of our former selves, as those who were lost and living in the world and now have put on Christ, been clothed with Him and are hidden with Him, Colossians 3, 1 through 4 there. There are certain things that people must do, that as Christians must do and realize, and when it comes to morality, gambling, as I said before, is on the rise here in America. In particular, though not limited to, sporting events. You can't turn on any sporting event, whether it be football or baseball or basketball or anything in between, where there's not commercials and advertisements for gambling on those events. I don't remember the exact numbers that I saw not too long ago, but gambling is right up there when it comes to how much is being made in the world, is very close to that of pornography now. Pornography being one of the number one avenues of immorality and financial gain there is, especially here in America, but even worldwide in many places. Gambling is quickly catching up. The reality of gambling, though, is that it is not really anything that is new. Gambling has been going on for a long time. As the preacher wrote there in Ecclesiastes chapter 1 and verse 9, there is nothing new under the sun, right? It's not new, and gambling certainly fits into that, as the preacher Solomon wrote, what has been and what has been is what will be, and what has been done is what will be done, and there is nothing new under the sun. Certainly, gambling is and does fit that reality. Though it is on a rise here in America, it's certainly not new to Americans. Though it is on a rise worldwide, it is certainly not new to our world. It's something that has been seen and been talked about and discussed for a very long time. Homer, in fact, in his Iliad of Odyssey in 850 BC, so almost 1,000 years before Christ was born, wrote about the white knuckles, bones of sheep marked on four sides and rolled like dice. The Romans, of course, gambled profusely. They gambled on chariot races and gladiator battles, and just about anything you could gamble on, they were known for gambling on it. From a historical and Christian perspective, of course, gambling has, for the most part, always been seen as a negative. It has always been seen as that which is sinful and not something that Christians should partake in. In fact, Tertullian wrote in around 200 AD, if you say that you are a Christian when you are a dice player, you say that you are not because you are a partaker of the world. Here, Tertullian wrote that, listen, as a Christian, and again, this is just 200 years after the birth of Christ, he says, if you're a Christian, you can't be one who gambles. You can't be one who plays the dice. You can't be one who does such a thing because these are of the world. Gambling is of the world. So gambling is, by definition, that which is not very new. It's, again, nothing new under the sun. They even gambled after Jesus' own clothes as he hung upon the cross, didn't they? Gambling and human fascination with it is something that's been around a long time, but as I said, Christians have always shunned it. Christianity as a whole and Christendom as a whole has always looked down upon it for the most part, but that's changing, like with many things. With many worldly things that are creeping in, there are those, even in the brotherhood, who have started advocating and do advocate for gambling in and as a Christian. So the question is that the case? Should Christians gamble? Is it an immoral thing or is it morally permissible according to God? Again, from a historical point of view, as we pointed out, that's not the case. But again, they haven't always been right in those historical church, quote-unquote, father writings. But before we dive straight into that, I want us to first examine and look at what gambling is not. Because I do think there is some confusion from time to time in what gambling specifically is. Gambling is, at its core, not taking a chance. Just because something is, or just because we do something, we take a chance at it, does not mean that we are gambling. I know a lot of times those terms are intertwined in our thinking or in our society today. You hear things like, well, being a farmer is a gamble. But there's a difference between gambling and something that just simply takes a chance. Gambling is certainly sinful, as we'll see, and is often stated as such as it should be. But gambling, just because it's not a guaranteed way of receiving money, does not mean that it is sinful. There is such a thing as a chance factor just simply in life and in the things we do. There is simply, as some might consider it, lucky or unlucky, depending on the chance encounter that takes place. And again, as I said, there are several notable things and notable ways people make a living that do have a reality of chance in them. Farming is certainly one of those areas. There is a certain amount of chance involved with it. You are reliant as a farmer to some degree on the weather. I've oftentimes joked and said plenty of times of my, of course, growing up in the city and not understanding how all that works. And I remember again at Hydro one time, and we were in a drought and everybody was talking about how bad things were and we need to pray for rain. And for 2 years we prayed for rain, and then the rains came and the rains came and they kept coming and they kept coming and it flooded everything. And I remember walking in saying, listen, aren't you farmers glad we've had all this rain? They said, no, everything's lost. It rained too much. And I learned right then I could never be a farmer. The reality is there are certain things in life, in fact, lots of things in life, that simply aren't a guarantee. There's chance involved. That doesn't make them sinful. In fact, they're not sinful at all. Working in the stock market, obviously, has some chance to it. Just like farming, there is skill involved and there is knowledge and wisdom that goes into it. The stock market is no different. There's an exchange of goods, but there certainly is a reality of chance involved. Chance is not the reason gambling is sinful. Gambling is not sinful because something is simply chance related. In fact, the preacher Solomon, inspired by God in Ecclesiastes 9 and verse 11, would write this: "Again I saw that under the sun the race is not to the swift, nor the battle to the strong, nor bread to the wise, nor riches to the intelligent, nor favor to those with knowledge, but time," notice, "and chance happen to them all." Solomon said, listen, you can be the wisest person on earth, and that might normally give you a heads up, an advantage. But that doesn't guarantee anything. Intelligence or wisdom and being swift or strong, those are all attributes that can give you an advantage, but because chance happens to everyone, it happens to them all, it is not a guarantee. Life is full of chance that takes place. And so when we talk about gambling, gambling is not sinful and wrong because of chance. Certainly there are many things that are involved with chance. What gambling is not also is, it isn't the games themselves or the things that are being gambled upon themselves. In fact, if you remove the money and the covetousness that goes with it, you remove the gambling aspect of those. Whether it be poker or blackjack or football or soccer. Whether it be dog fighting or people just betting on who will win the race in their neighborhood, anything can be gambled upon. But that doesn't necessitate and mean that that which is being gambled upon is wrong. Certainly no one would suggest that, assuming all things are normal, that a person playing football in their yard or on a team would be sinning. Or basketball. Or running a race with a friend. Neither are some of the games we associate with gambling. Poker, for example, can certainly be played and is by a lot of people without any money or covetousness involved at all. Now, with that being said, as Brother Moses mentioned this morning, we got to be very careful with these things, though. Where there is that reality, such as poker or blackjack or things that are highly involved with and are associated with it, yes, removing money does eliminate the gambling from it, but our influence can also play a part. We've got to be careful with that. As Christians, I'm not suggesting go out on the side corner with your friends and play poker in front of everybody, them not knowing you have no money involved. Obviously, that would not be wise. That could cause a stumbling block in front of others. There's all sorts of things that could make that wrong other than the gambling aspect of it. All I'm simply saying is that anything can be gambled upon. And so just because someone gambles on something does not necessarily necessitate that event or that game or that thing is wrong. So as Christians, we have to make wise decisions. As Christians, we can't just say that everything is gambling because we want to say that. And so when we look at it, we see also, the question then is, what does the Bible say? What does the Bible tell us about gambling? It's found in the passage we read as we began this lesson from Colossians chapter 3. In verse 5 in particular, and it has to do with that word that isn't really talked about a lot or used more specifically nowadays. It's a word that's come out of favor somewhat as far as that word itself is covetousness. In fact, I would venture to say a lot of people might not even know what that word means. What does covetous mean? Well, when we look at the Bible, the word covet and its similar words, such as covetousness, is certainly found throughout the Scriptures. We find it in a lot of places. For example, Exodus chapter 20 and verse 17. You shall not covet your neighbor's house. You shall not covet your neighbor's wife, or his male servant, or his female servant, or his ox, or his donkey, or anything that is your neighbor's. We see Jesus declare this concerning covetousness in Luke chapter 12 and verse 15. He said to them, take care and be on your guard against all covetousness, for one's life does not consist in the abundance of his possessions. So we see covetousness has to deal with and does deal with the longing and wanting of what someone else has, and it also has to deal with the idea of possessions and the garnering of it, whether that be financial possessions or someone else's wife. Each can have an aspect of covetousness. In Romans chapter 1, verse 29, we see in this great list of evils there, says, they are filled with all manner of unrighteousness, evil, covetousness, malice. They are full of envy, murder, strife, deceit, maliceness. They are gossips. In this list, we see a number of things. Covetousness placed right in there. And again, in our text in Colossians chapter 3. In verse 5, we see what covetousness really is. Put to death, therefore, what is earthly in you, sexual immorality or fornication, impurity, passion, evil desire, and covetousness, which is idolatry. And that is why covetousness is obviously sinful. It is idolatry. It is placing one's possessions, is placing what someone else has that we want above God even. So a good definition of covetousness that I came across and is biblically accurate is this: wanting what someone else has and doing what it takes to try and get it from that person or persons. And again, Jesus declared all covetousness we need to refrain from, leave, not be a part of. When we take advantage of someone as a result of wanting what they have, that's covetousness. When we're seeking to have power over someone else's possessions, and we want what they have and take what they have, no matter the means, that is covetousness. Again, wanting what someone else has and doing what it takes to try and get it from them, that person, or that group. So how are these linked then? How is gambling and covetousness linked together? When someone gambles, when they place a bet, when they go and they seek the lottery or they pull the handle of the machine, whatever the case may be, whether they throw the dice, whatever it is, when someone gambles, they are trying to win someone else's money. It's that simple. There is no exchange of goods being made. They are putting money in with the intent of taking someone else's money. If there is no possession, there is no financial gain, and again, that's not necessarily money, that can be any number of things. I remember where my grandparents lived, or at least in the summer lived, there in Clarendon. There was a 4-H ranch, and the guy won this huge ranch off gambling. Someone put in their whole ranch in a gambling, and this person won it. Gambling isn't necessarily money, but is anything. Again, we put in with wanting what someone else has. Now, there's a lot of excuses that are given to try to eliminate gambling as a sin. People will say things like, well, with the lottery, for example, I'm simply helping the economy by buying a lottery ticket. And they're saying, well, listen, by me putting money in, I am helping the economy because the lottery is certainly and is most certainly used to help different things, schools, for example, and others. Now, to be clear, the lottery has never actually benefited a state. Every single research ever done into it, every state has come out far worse after a lottery was implemented than before it was. But putting that aside, just simply the argument of, well, I'm trying to help the economy. I'm just trying to benefit. If that was the sole purpose, no one would buy a lottery ticket. They don't buy the lottery ticket to help the economy. They buy the lottery ticket to win the money, and if they lose, that's the reason, their excuse for putting money into it. No one buys it hoping they lose, and there's the key. What about casinos? People say things concerning casinos. Well, I don't go to casinos to gamble and make money. I just go to have fun. I hear this all the time. Listen, it's just kind of like a pastime, just to blow off some steam and have some fun again. I have never heard anyone go to the casino to say, I can't wait to lose money. I can't wait. I'm going there specifically to give that casino my money because I don't want it. No, they're going there and they're choosing that because they're hoping to win money. Interestingly enough, you never hear how much people lose, you only hear how much they win. And casinos get bigger for a reason. What about if I'm not taking money from my family's mouth, then what's the harm in it? Well, first off, by definition, that's not really true because you are taking money out of your family. But let's just say we're talking about excess only, and that's the reality. Just because something is excess and just because you don't necessarily have to have it for food, clothing, or shelter does not mean using it in an improper way is okay. Certainly no one would suggest going to the strip club and putting money and giving money to the strippers is a good use of stewardship. As a Christian anyway, I would hope. So let's be clear. No one gambles hoping to lose. What are they hoping to do? To get someone else's money. You gamble for the sole purpose, whether understanding it or not, to take money from someone else. Someone else had to lose that money for one to gain that money. And so it is, therefore, covetousness. So what does God say then is a proper way, or what are proper ways as Christians we are to receive possessions or financial means? We are, of course, to labor for it. From the very beginning, God has been clear. The way we gain as human beings, the main way we gain is through laboring for what we have. Even in Genesis chapter 3 and verse 19, by the sweat of your face you shall eat bread. God told Adam, listen, once you sinned and they were being kicked out, how were they to gain their food? How were they to get their possessions? Yes, God would watch over them and God would be there for them. But they were going to have to work for it. They were going to have to labor for their food. In Ephesians chapter 4, verse 28, let the thief no longer steal, but rather let him labor, doing honest work with his own hands, that he may have something to share with anyone in need. Paul writes here, listen, if you want something, don't steal it. If you want money, don't steal it. You need to go get a job. You need to labor for it. God expects us as Christians to labor for those things we find and want and need. In fact, he would go so far as we know in 2 Thessalonians 3 and verse 10 to say, if one is not willing to work, they are not or should not be willing to eat. If anyone is not willing to work, let him not eat. To the ones who beg, and are unwilling to work. It's one thing to help them out, it's another thing to enable. Because God says, listen, if they're not willing to work, they don't need to eat. Now again, are there specific situations where this isn't going to apply? Sure, for the disabled person who can't work, or for the one who's sick, or what, and maybe can't work for a widow maybe who can no longer. There's lots of situations, but even in that, of course, the widow indeed is the one who is of that certain age, doesn't have family to take care of them. The reality is, God says the main way in which we receive possessions in a legitimate way is to labor for them. We can also invest our possessions. Jesus gives an entire parable on this reality. In the parable of the talents, and this is just one snippet there in Matthew 25 and verse 27, when he said to the servant, "You ought to have invested my money with the bankers, and at my coming I should have received what is my own with interest." Here God is telling us, listen, there's nothing wrong with investing our money, investing our physical means in the attempt of growing that in interest, whether it be through stock market, whether it be through trade, whatever the case may be. Banks are certainly one, though they don't give you too much nowadays. But there is that reality, right? There's always that exchange of goods, which we'll talk about. And so, we also see, lastly, that we can and receive possessions through gifts of generosity. As Christians, we are expected to be generous people, to help one another out, both inside and outside the church, especially inside the church. And in 1 Corinthians chapter 16, verse 1 and 3, Paul talks about the taking up of a collection. And he says there, "Now concerning the collection for the saints, as I directed the churches of Galatia, so you also are to do. On the first day of every week, each of you is to put something aside and store it up as he may prosper, so that there will be no collecting when I come. And when I arrive, notice, I will send those whom you accredited by letter to carry your gift to Jerusalem." Now, obviously, this gives us explanation on how we are to, as a church, collect funds. But it also shows that gift giving, gifts of generosity, are a good way of helping each other out. In this case, Jerusalem had been struggling. There was a famine that was going on. There was a lot of things that had taken place, and they were in need. And so other congregations were willingly and generously giving of their possessions to help. The Macedonian church even giving to the point of hurting. Paul would even say there in 2 Corinthians 11, 7 through 9, the same idea in supporting preachers. "Or did I commit a sin in humbling myself so that you might be exalted? Because I preached God's gospel to you free of charge. I robbed other churches by accepting support from them in order to serve you. And when I was with you and was indeed in need, I did not burden anyone, for the brothers who came from Macedonia supplied my need. So I refrained and will refrain from burdening you in any way." And so here we see that free gift was given to help out in that specific situation. So the Bible tells us exactly how we are to gain that which God has made us stewards of. How we are to increase in what we have been given, that we are to be content, though we didn't get into that. But that is a key factor in gambling. People aren't content, are they? And when people ignore what God has said in laboring and the gifts of generosity and investing for their own desires and in their own minds, a quick way to make money, though it never really works out that way, they end up sinning. Gambling in every Christian must, as Tertullian said, be put to death, be done with. Or as God said, put to death, and as Tertullian said, must not be found amongst us. We cannot be Christians and be Christ-like, therefore, and be ones who are found gambling. Again, that doesn't mean, and we've all been a part of things we shouldn't, and where we correct, and I'm reminded of the quote that's been around for a while, but is appropriate here. when one said gambling is stealing by mutual consent, because gambling promises the poor what prosperity performs for the rich. It's a false promise that cannot be and will never be adhered to. It's one of those things that we get caught up in, or can get easily caught up in, if we're not careful. And so we must be aware that God says, put away these things. Put away covetousness, because it is idolatry. When we want what others have, we're not content with what God has given us. And we're not wanting to do what God has said to get what we need and what He will supply through making us stewards of. So this morning, as you reflect upon your walk with God, and as we go outside those doors and we help those who are lost in sin, or we help someone we know who's struggling with gambling, let us ever be mindful of what God says here. Let us be able to help them and help them come out of that, or help them see the dangers of it from both a physical and a spiritual point of view. Let us be that light to them. Because again, it's becoming more and more not only accepted by the world, but accepted by those who call themselves Christians. We have to be very mindful of that. Careful and help everyone in those situations. So from God's point of view, which is the only valid point of view, it is sinful to covet, and gambling is covetousness. So this morning, if there's someone here who needs prayers, maybe there's someone here who gambles I'm not aware of. I don't think so, though. You need help with that. But listen, we live in a tough world, don't we? And maybe gambling's not the thing you struggle with, but we all have those things we struggle. If you've been losing a fight with sin recently, and we can help you as the Lord's church, that we can wrap our arms around you and pray with you and strengthen you, let us do that. Maybe you're just simply struggling. This world, again, is difficult, and we have our ups and downs, and maybe you just need that uplift, that edification, that encouragement. Let us be that for you as well, but we can't know if we aren't told how we can help. So if you need that help this morning, let us know by coming forward as we stand and as we sing.